Hey, I want to welcome you back to church. I missed a lot of you guys last week. I know that you missed too. With the weather being bad and stuff, I wasn't sure if I was going to make it. The kids and I, we got in a van and headed this way, and snow drifts, and it was bad. And then I saw a horse and buggy coming up the road. And I thought, well, if he can do it, I can do it. So hold my coffee and watch this. So we made it, but we missed you. And when you see what I'm going to be talking about today, some of you are going to wish perhaps that why couldn't this have been last week's topic instead of this week? So we'll see. But I just want to remind you that we're in this series entitled The Problem of God. The problem of God. And for some of you, seeing that video up there week after week is probably starting to grate on you, and you're probably getting a little annoyed with some of the opinions in there. But the reality is we live in an age of skepticism, and there are skeptics everywhere. And so what we're trying to do in this series is answer some of those skeptics' questions. And as I've told you each and every week in this series, I've got a threefold purpose for this series. Now, the first and foremost is I want God to be exalted and glorified. That's what I want to have happen, because those are the things that are due him. Those of us who are followers, I want our convictions and our faith to be strengthened. Understanding that there is evidence for our faith. And then those who are struggling, who may be skeptical, who may be asking questions about God, I want to provide some help. But first and foremost, I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to convince you and to convict you. Those aren't my jobs. Those are God's jobs. And God is much better at that job than I am anyway. My job is simply to provide evidence and to help you to understand and to realize that there is evidence for our faith. We've seen in this series so far that there's evidence for the existence of God. There's evidence to have a faith and belief in that. Last week we looked at the evidence for the reliability of Scripture, that yes, we can trust the Word of God and we can trust the Bible. It is reliable. And the whole mantra of this series, what I'm challenging you to do, what I'm asking you to do, is to be willing to follow where the evidence leads, not where you hope the evidence leads. But simply follow wherever the evidence may lead you. In prepping for this series, as I've told you, I met with a group of high school boys. I had lunch together, and here's what I learned in that meeting. Most of the objections to God's existence were based upon assumptions and perceptions of what they have seen and what they have heard from other Christians. Most of the objections with God had little to do with evidence, but more about what they have seen in other believers and what they have heard, taught, and said by other Christians, and even from the church. That's where most of the objections lie. And so a lot of things we heard was that Christianity today is viewed as being cultish. It's a cult. It's antiquated. It's out of context. It's out of touch with culture. Arguments are out there of who are you to tell me what I can do and what I can't do, especially with my body. The Bible is really just a book that tells me what I can and can't do. It's about my relationship with God and nothing else. And these objections, listen, these objections are probably no more clear, no more stronger, and no more a problem for people than in the area of sex and sexuality. For a lot of people, sex is a big problem when it comes to being a follower of God, because the Bible and God seem to be out of touch with culture today, because God is viewed as being too limiting, too restrictive. And so the tension is there. Is the church's teaching on sex, is God's plan for sex out of touch with our culture? And so today, we're going to talk about the problem of sex. Now, some of you just got really, really awkward and uncomfortable. So let's just bring all the lights down in the room, and I'll just stand up here and teach, and I won't have to see your faces, because this is getting uncomfortable for me. But I want you to know, the last time I taught about this, sex in the church, I had my mother and father sitting right here in the second row, and my dad was amening the entire time. Next to my wife was sitting her mom, and she was taking notes through the message. That really made me uncomfortable and awkward, and I had to tell Eve, take your mom's notebook away. But it's not going to be that bad today. But the question is there, the tension is there, and for a lot of skeptics, it is viewed that God and the teaching of the church is so out of touch with our culture today, therefore I can't be a follower of God. It was the famous atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell who made this statement. He said, the worst feature of the Christian religion is their attitude towards sex. This is a skeptic atheist who says the worst feature about Christianity is its attitude towards sex. Margaret Sanger, a name that you're probably familiar with, the founder of Planned Parenthood, described Christians as moralists who promote self-denial and suppression because of their teaching on abstinence before marriage. Christopher Hitchens, a famous atheist who recently died, said any religious view should be banned from the modern discourse about sexuality. The issue of sex is a huge issue for a lot of skeptics out there, and we are perceived to be out of touch with culture because God's plan for sex, the way it has been taught, it is deemed to be too limited, too restrictive for today. Therefore, it's out of touch for culture, thus a big problem for a lot of people. Because the Christian perspective is that sex is too limiting, and anything that limits my freedom, catch that word, anything that limits my freedom has no place in the discourse and the discussion today. Now, isn't it interesting that the Christian perspective is demanded on issues such as poverty and homelessness and how are we going to take care of the poor? But when it comes to issues about sexuality, the church is told to stay away and hands off because it's too limiting and it's too restrictive. Well, that's because we live in the Enlightenment. Since the 1800s, the Enlightenment, the highest good in society, the highest good in culture and society is being able to freely choose what I want to do. Therefore, anything that is restrictive, anything that limits my freedom, my ability to choose whatever I want to do has to go. And so we fight against religious authority. We fight against civil authority because anything that limits my freedom, my ability to choose is bad, it's wrong, and it has no place in modern discourse and discussion. So the question has to be asked. Is the church's view, is the Bible's view on sex counterculture? Let me answer that right up front before we go any further. Yes. God's view on sex, the Bible's plan for sex, is definitely counterculture. But that should not surprise you. Because following Jesus is always going to be counterculture. You see, the problem is in Western culture today, what we want is we want a God who is loving, a God who is forgiving, a God who is merciful, a God who provides for us, but nobody wants a God who is holy and who is demanding. We want a God who just loves us and provides for us and makes us feel better about ourselves, but we don't want a God who is holy. We don't want a God who is demanding. But the reality is we have to understand God is holy, God is different from us, and yes, God is demanding. When God called his people Israel to come and to follow him, in the book of Leviticus, he told them, be holy as I am holy. Be different from the culture around you. Live according to a different standard, a different way of life. Why? Because he is different. God told him to be holy. Listen, to follow God has always been a call to be different from the culture around us, to be holy because he is holy. Now, to be different from the culture doesn't mean that we have to be weird, but it just means that we have a different standard that we're called to live according to. And the reason for that is because the God that we follow is holy. He is different from us. God is counterculture, therefore we're supposed to be counterculture. Jesus picked up this mantle in his ministry. Look at what he said in Luke chapter 9. Starting in verse 23, look at what Jesus said here. Whoever wants to be my disciple must what? Deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will what? Lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will save it. Can there be anything more counterculture than that statement right there by Jesus? If you want to follow me, take up your cross, deny yourself. Whoever wants to save their life must lose it. There is nothing more counterculture than that, than a call from Jesus to say we must die daily to our wants, to our wishes, to our desires. We need to put the needs of others before our own. There can be nothing more counterculture than that. And this is a call from Jesus for us to be different from the world around us. And maybe that's why Peter told us to always be ready to give an answer. Always be ready to give an answer to those who ask why we live according to a different standard, why we have a different hope than the rest of the world does. Because this call to be counterculture is not a call to separate ourselves from society, by the way. It's not a call to retreat. It's not a call to withdraw from society. In order to be counterculture, you got to be in the culture. In order to stand out from society, you have to be in the society. And it's our counterculture voice, by the way, that makes us relevant to the world today. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but being counterculture is actually what makes us relevant to the world today. You know, the church has been entrusted with the message of how we go from death to life because of the sacrifice of Jesus. The church has been entrusted with the message of how you find true life, true freedom, true joy, true satisfaction, true fulfillment in life. That message has been entrusted to the church. And you know what? Those are the very things that the world is looking for today, and they're not finding it in the world. That's why our counterculture voice makes us relevant to the world today. The problem is this. We know that we're called to be counterculture, but we haven't done a very good job in the church of explaining why. We haven't answered the question why. God, why do you call us to certain things? God, why do you ask us to do certain things? And when it comes to the issue of sex, we have not done a very good job of explaining God's plan for sex. Now, we understand the restrictions, the boundaries that he's placed on sex, but we haven't done a very good job of explaining the why. And we have to admit that a lot of the teaching in the church has come across as an anti-sex message. It just has. And the reason for that is a lot of our teaching has come in response to an over-sexualized culture. And we have reasoned things like, well, okay, the public school teaches about sex. They talk about sex. Everybody over there must be having sex, so therefore let's not talk about it at all. Or let's paint it as very negative and in a negative light, and let's, even in the early church, it was taught that it was only for having children, and that was it. And the way I was taught about sex, by the way, growing up, was that it was wrong, it was dirty, it was vile. If you do it, you're going to hell. So save it for the one you love, and by the way, here's a book for the night when you get married. Now, some of you are laughing about that, but that was your experience as well. This is the way that we were taught about sex. And so what has happened is this. One of the myths that has arisen out of the church's teaching and talking about sex is this belief that God must be anti-sex. He must be against it. Have I said that word enough today? Because my face is starting to get red. God must be against sex. He must be anti-sex. And the reason for that is because God is seldom associated with joy and pleasure, so therefore he must be anti-sex. This is a myth that has risen. Here's what I want you to know, and let me answer that right up front before we go any further. Okay? You guys are all on the edge of your seat, I can tell. Here we go. Let me answer this for you. And I'm going to do this by looking at my notes and not looking at you. I'm kidding. Sex is God's idea, it is God's creation, and it is God's gift to us today. God is not anti-sex. God created sex. It was his idea, and he has given it to us today to be enjoyed. I don't know about you, but I can think of no greater evangelistic tool than that. I mean, don't you want to know the God who created sex and designed it and gave it to us as his gift? You guys are not even looking at me. Some of you are looking at the wall right behind me. Listen, God is not anti-sex. It was his idea and his gift. Look at the very beginning of Genesis. The book of Genesis, we read about creation. And when God created Adam and Eve and he placed them in the garden, we see the very first wedding ceremony there. And God gave them to each other. And here's what I want you to notice. Look here at chapter 2 with me. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. This is a picture of perfect intimacy, emotional, physical. The key word in that verse is both, by the way. They were both naked, and they felt no shame. Hold on to that. Let's go down to Genesis 1. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it. God saw all that he had made, and it was what? Very good. Hold on to that phrase. It was very good. Now, the first 5 days of creation, God looks upon his creation and says, it is good. He gets to day 6, the climax of his creation, and he looks upon the man and wife that he has created there, and the climax of his creation, don't miss this, is our naked bodies. That's where God says it is very good. And then he tells the man and woman in the garden to be fruitful, to multiply. They're both together. They're naked. They feel no shame. God is not anti-sex. God created sex, and he gave it to them as a way, gave it to us as a way to seal a covenant of husband and wife, but also as a way for maintaining this covenant. Check out this verse in Deuteronomy chapter 24. When a man would join the army, if a man is recently married, he must not be sent to war or have any other duty laid upon him for 1 year. For 1 year. He is to be free to stay at home and bring happiness to the wife he is married. God is not anti-sex. When a man who was newly married, he was prevented from serving in the army for a year so that he could stay home and enjoy the pleasures of his wife. If you read through the book of Song of Solomon, you'll notice a lot of erotic language that takes place there. I mean, it can make you blush. I don't recommend this for a family devotional reading. All right, I just don't recommend that. But you'll see things and you're like, what? I didn't know that was in the Bible. Do you know how God responds to that? He doesn't say, hey, stop talking like that, you dirty children. He doesn't say that. Look what he says in chapter 5, verse 1. eat, friends. Drink your fill of love. Is God anti-sex? Well, if you read through the Bible, you can come to no other conclusion than that God is not anti-sex, but rather that God created sex and he gave it to us to be enjoyed. Yes, he has placed boundaries around it that we're going to talk about. But when it's enjoyed in its proper setting of marriage and inside of those boundaries, sex is a great gift. And what we need to do is we need to allow the Bible to be the lens through which we understand God's view about sex, not the opinions of others, but rather God's word. Let's look there, and let's find out what God truly thinks about sex and what he believes about it. There's a lot of current views and myths in culture today, and I want to talk just about a couple of those today. One is that sex is just another natural appetite that we have. It's just another natural appetite we have, and whenever I'm hungry, I feed myself. And so whenever I have this need, I just go ahead and I feed that need and that appetite. Now, if you follow this to its logical conclusion, which comes out of an evolutionary theory, when you follow that to its logical conclusion that sex is just an appetite, and whenever we're hungry, we feed that appetite, then you can no longer say that abusing other people and taking advantage of other people is wrong because you're following this theory that sex is just another appetite. But here's what we know. It is wrong to abuse other people. It is wrong to harm other people. But the underlying teaching in this is this thought that I'm only harming myself, so therefore I should be free to be able to do whatever I want. And this has really seen rise, by the way, in online pornography. And mom and dad, if you're not protecting your computer and your home against pornography online, you're really just too naive. And we need to wake up and we need to protect our children against the effects of this. Because here's the truth. We don't live in a bubble isolated from each other. We don't live in a bubble isolated from each other. Our actions affect each other. And I have had far too many people in my office for counseling through the years whose families have been destroyed by the misuse of sex. I've had far too many people in my office for counseling whose lives have been destroyed. And pornography today has caused untold damage to men and women. Don't tell me that your actions only affect you and they affect nobody else, because that is a lie from hell and it is not true. It is not true. Sex is not just an appetite to be fed. Another popular myth today is that great sex, if you want to enjoy great sex, it's got to be sex with no strings attached. In other words, sex inside the bonds of marriage is too restrictive, it's too limiting, and therefore it becomes boring. But if you want to experience great sex and joy and pleasure, you've got to have sex outside of that with no strings attached. First thing, there is no such thing as sex with no strings attached. There isn't. Sex is not just a physical act. But in the act of sex, we're not just uniting physically, we're uniting emotionally as well. There is always a connection. There are always going to be strings attached. And I think experience tells us this. But not only that, but sociology today is also debunking this myth. In a recent study entitled The Case for Marriage, it points out that more married men and women claim greater frequency and enjoyment in sex than single people and those who are living together. A recent report also in U.S. News and World Report says the same thing, and it concludes by saying this: promoting marriage will make for a lot more happy men and women. In other words, what sociology is telling us today, what psychology is telling us today, is that in order to experience maximum pleasure and enjoyment and fulfillment, it takes the amazing and exclusive relationship of marriage. A commitment that is made till death do us part. Because inside of that marriage relationship, husband and wife are free to give and to receive without worry. Therefore, marriage is necessary to find true fulfillment. It's not just experience telling us that this is not true. It's not just psychology and sociology today, but rather even Solomon said the same thing. Look at what Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 5. I really don't want to read this out loud, but I will. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares. Let them be yours alone. By the way, he's not talking about just getting a drink of water, okay? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed. May you rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Yes, I skipped something there. Why, my son, be intoxicated with another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? Yes, I skipped some things there. It's okay. You see what Solomon is saying there? Solomon understands the power of sex in marriage, so much so that he is imploring, he is begging his children to guard it, to keep it pure. Drink from your own well. See, the spring of sex is meant to bring delight and refreshment to our spouses. And Solomon is cautioning here in chapter 5 against lust and against the pitfall of finding this elsewhere outside of the bonds of marriage. And his challenge is to embrace God's plan for sex. If you want to encounter maximum fulfillment and joy and satisfaction, then embrace God's plan for it. And to understand the power of this statement, you've got to know about Solomon. Not only is Solomon the wisest man who have ever lived, but Solomon here is also speaking from experience. This was a man who denied himself nothing that his eyes desired. He denied himself nothing, and he sought pleasure and joy and fulfillment in everything. And in the end, he's looking back and he's saying, I was wrong. I was wrong. If you want to find true fulfillment and joy, embrace God's plan. You know, science tells us this, experience tells us this, but just look around at the results that we see in our culture today. We have thrown off the boundaries that God has given us for sex. Have we found what we were looking for? Have we found the freedom and the joy and the satisfaction today? No, it appears that we are more broken than we were before, and we haven't found what we thought we would find. This is why we need to embrace God's teaching about sex. You see, God has given us sex as a gift. He stitched it into our history. It's the greatest, it's the most powerful nonverbal signal of love and commitment and loyalty and unity that we have. It's the bringing together of two souls who say, I love you completely, I belong to you completely, I am yours exclusively, not just in this moment, but until death do us part. See, God's not a killjoy. Instead, he wants us to be givers, receivers of pleasure. Sex is given to us, husband and wife committed to each other in love. And yes, he's placed boundaries around this wonderful gift. But inside of those boundaries, that gift flourishes. You know, a fish was created with boundaries too, wasn't it? And inside of the water, the fish flourishes. But you take that fish out of the water and what happens? It dies. And just about every gift that we enjoy has boundaries. You think about the gift of fire. In its right setting, it's wonderful. On the couch, it's bad and destructive and deadly. And while these restrictions can feel limiting, let me remind you that through many of the great things of life come through discipline, focus, and commitment. The greater yes is only possible when we're willing to say no to lesser things. And what you need to understand about God's plan is this. God's plan is not to keep you from experiencing joy and pleasure. But God's plan is there to keep you from experiencing pain and regret. And you know what? It's time for the church to recapture our prophetic voice and to share the message of God's plan for sex in a biblical sexual ethic, not because we like to judge people, not because we want to limit the rights of people, but rather because we trust that what God says is best and that his way is the way to find ultimate fulfillment, satisfaction, and joy. Listen, these are his gifts. And we need to offer this alternative to the world around us. Now, with any prophetic voice, here's what you've got to expect. Prophetic voices are always rejected, they're always shut out, and they're always claimed to be weird, but that doesn't stop us from proclaiming that voice. I grew up in public school in Portsmouth, Ohio. I remember in high school going to sex ed class, and I remember them giving us a test to see what our risks were for sexually transmitted diseases. And the higher the score you got, the higher the risk. I always scored a 0. And in that moment, I was always made to feel weird and an outcast. But here's what I'm here to tell you today. Experience has taught me that I was not being weird, rather I was being wise. And I am thankful that when I came to marriage with my wife, I came as a virgin and not bringing baggage from other relationships with me into that relationship. I was not being weird. I was being wise. And young people, Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians 6, that while everything may be permissible, it's not beneficial. And you need to hear somebody tell you who loves you and who cares for you, that when you embrace God's plan for sexuality, your culture may say you're weird. You're not being weird. You're being wise. Because God's plan is there to prevent you from experiencing pain and regret. And you need to understand that. And so the charge, are we brainwashing our children in the church to believe that the Bible teaching about sex is the right way? You're darn right I am. Absolutely I am. And I will continue to teach my children and other children about God's plan for sex, rather than allow Beyonce and other influences in culture to teach about sex. You know, I don't know if you understand this or not, parents, but your kids are bombarded with messages about sex every day. In 1 year, you'll see 14,000 different messages from culture regarding sex and sexuality. My question to you is, does the cultural teaching about sex match God's design? No. And this is why the church needs to regain our prophetic voice, proclaiming a different way, a better way. Not so much saying that the world is just wrong, but let's share a better way, a healthier way. Because we see the destruction that the cultural lies have wrought in regards to sex. And we need to understand that God's gift of sex, when it's used in the way he intended it, it's a great gift. But when we take it outside of those boundaries and we use it in a wrong way, it becomes destructive. God is not trying to keep you from joy and pleasure, but rather he's trying to keep you from experiencing pain and regret. God is not anti-sex, and we need to know that. We're done with that topic, okay? Next week, we're going to continue looking at the problem of God, and we're going to answer the question, if God exists, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world today? So I hope you'll come back and join us next week. Can I say a prayer for us this morning? Father, thank you. Lord, I thank you for the gift that you've given us and also for the understanding, the boundaries that you have placed upon it. Lord, help us to trust that you're trying to protect us, to keep us from experiencing hurt and pain and regret. Lord, also help us as a church to be able to regain our prophetic voice and to share with others about your plan and what's there for us. Lord, I thank you so much for your love, and it's in Jesus' name we pray.